Good evening to everyone in Europe. Good afternoon to friends joining in North America. I hope you're all well and healthy wherever you are. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm a research fellow in politics here at St Edmund's College at the University of Cambridge. It's my great pleasure to introduce this event on the possible political, economic, and legal consequences of Irish unification with Jim O'Callaghan TD. I'm doing this whilst I'm admitting everybody in the waiting room. The huge numbers in attendance is testament to how important and topical this subject is, and I thank you all for being with us. We want to finish in an hour, so in a moment I'm going to hand over to Professor Richard Penty, Master of Sydney Sussex College, who will introduce our speaker, Jim O'Callaghan TD, and his discussant, Professor Eugenio Biagini. Before that, I want to briefly mention the format for today. After the Master's introductory remarks, Jim will speak for up to 20 minutes. I've agreed with Jim to let him know when his time is nearly up. Jim's paper, I believe, is now or will shortly be available on his website. Jim's intervention will be followed by a 10-minute discussion with Professor Biagini and Jim on the subject of his paper. This will then allow us up to 20-25 minutes for questions and answers. Some of you have submitted questions already, and the chat function is enabled. Please use it to submit further questions. I'll be looking at it for the next 30 minutes. I will try to put as many questions as possible to Jim in the time that we have. Please keep your questions as short and to the point as you can manage. Finally, I want to thank Sydney Sussex for facilitating this event and for its sustained support for Irish studies and Irish affairs at Cambridge. Long may that continue. Without further ado, I hand you over to Professor Penty.
You're muted, Professor.
Okay. Thank you. So it didn't seem to let me unmute myself. So thank you, Barry, for that introduction. My name's Richard Penty. I'm the Master of Sydney Sussex, and Sydney Sussex has been hosting for many years now a series of presentations on Irish history. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here tonight. And particularly so many of you, nearly 300 have turned up so far. So it's a wonderful testament to the, as Barry said, the importance of the subject. This talk is also, or these talks have also received a lot of interest. So I understand today that it was trailed in the Irish Times. So a lot of interest in Ireland as well in as in the UK. The other reason I've been asked to introduce this is because both Jim and Eugenio are associated, of course, with Sydney Sussex College. So I'll explain why shortly. So let me just get on with the introduction. So Jim O'Callaghan, of course, has been a TD for Fianna Fáil since 2016, and is currently his party's Justice spokesperson. He also sits on the Committee on Finance and the Committee on Education, Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science in the current Dáil. He represents the Dublin Bay South constituency, and he's a senior counsel and previously was a councillor on Dublin City Council. He holds a BCL degree from University College Dublin, and from Sydney Sussex College he holds the Master of Law and an MPhil in Criminology degrees. He's also a Barrister at Law degree from the Honourable Society of King's Inns in Dublin. Most importantly though, and very sadly having watched the rugby this weekend, while studying at Sydney, he twice represented Cambridge at the annual Rugby Union varsity match. So it's really good to welcome you here tonight, Jim. Eugenio Eugenio Biagini is one of our college history fellows here at Sydney Sussex, and he's also the Professor of Modern and Contemporary History in the University of Cambridge. He is the founder of this Modern Irish History Seminar, and as I mentioned earlier, this meets in normal times in Sydney Sussex College on a fortnightly basis. And he also organises the annual Brian Lenihan Memorial Lecture. Brian Lenihan was also received the LLM degree from Sydney. Eugenio's recent publications include the Cambridge Social History of Ireland and the Cultural History of Democracy. And that's a work of 6 volumes for which he's the general editor. So thank you very much to both Jim and Eugenio. Really looking forward to hearing you speak, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thanks very much. And the first thing I want to do is I want to thank the Master and Fellows of Sydney Sussex College for hosting this event. In particular, I want to thank Professor Eugenio Biagini for inviting me to give this paper. And I also want to thank Barry Colfer, who's a research student at Cambridge, but who many of you may have detected emanates from Ireland, for organising the webinar this evening. Listen, it's a real pleasure for me to return to Sydney Sussex College, albeit remotely, having spent 2 extremely happy years there in the early 1990s studying law as a postgraduate student. And in fact, at that time, Sydney Sussex College had very strong links and relationships with Ireland and with Northern Ireland. And in particular, a lot of undergraduate students from both jurisdictions and postgraduate students came to Sydney Sussex to study law and indeed other disciplines. And I'm pleased to say, and I know from speaking to people still involved with the college, that the links between Sydney Sussex College and both jurisdictions on the island have got even stronger. And I think that's a real reflection of the very good relationship that exists between our 2 islands. I'm also aware that there are very many people who are watching and listening this evening who may be from outside Ireland and who may have difficulty in understanding the differences that exist between Irish political parties. You know, in fairness, that's a difficulty that many people in Ireland may have as well. But I think it's important at the outset that I tell you where I'm coming from politically, because on the topic of Irish reunification, I think it's fair to say that I'm not an objective observer or commentator in respect of it. As the Master said to you, I was elected to Dáil Éireann, which is the lower but more powerful house of the Irish Parliament, back in 2016, and I was re-elected in 2020. I was elected by the people in the constituency of Dublin Bay South. I was elected because I'm a representative of the Fianna Fáil political party. Fianna Fáil is a Republican party that was founded by Eamon de Valera back in 1926. Its leader is Micheál Martin, who is the current Taoiseach of Ireland, and its primary aim is to achieve the independence and unity of Ireland. And although, as I said at the outset, the links between Sydney Sussex and Ireland are very strong, I think it's fair to say that the links between Sydney Sussex and Irish republicanism are faint, to put it mildly. Although, as the Master said in his introduction, I'm not the first elected member of Dáil Éireann representing Fianna Fáil to graduate through Sydney Sussex. That distinction belongs to the late Brian Lenihan, who was a Minister for Finance and a Minister for Justice in Ireland a number of years ago. I think it's important at the outset to emphasise that, like Brian Lenihan, like our Taoiseach Micheál Martin, I am an Irish Republican. Fianna Fáil has always been committed exclusively to peaceful means in order to achieve our primary aim, which is to see our country and peoples peaceful, prosperous and united. And I suppose the reason why this debate is taking place this evening and why other people are debating the issue of Irish reunification is that prospect, that aim, appears to be a realistic prospect at present. Now listen, the most important thing I also want to say to you is that there is another side to this debate. And it's a side that you won't hear from me this evening, but I think it is very important that we are aware that just as it is my cherished aim to see a united Ireland, it is also the cherished aim of unionist parties and very many unionist people in Northern Ireland to retain the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I think it's important that anyone who gets involved in this debate is very respectful about the other arguments that are presented, and it's extremely important that persons such as me seek to put forward responses to concerns that no doubtedly are held by people who come from the unionist tradition. Listen, I've prepared a paper for this speech, and I'm not going to read it out. It's available online on the website, as the Master said. But I think it'd be worthwhile just considering at the outset, why is it that the issue of Irish reunification has become more prominent in discussions in recent times? And I think there are a number of factors for it. First of all, obviously, Brexit has been a contributing factor. It was a conundrum, Brexit, to try to figure out how we could solve the problem of the United Kingdom wishing to leave the customs union and the single market. And I suppose an objective analysis, and one of the responses to it would be, well, why don't we unify that island? That would resolve a lot of the issues. So I think Brexit has contributed to the fact that it is being more prominently discussed. I also think COVID is a contribution to it as well. We've seen a terrible pandemic on both sides of the border in Ireland, as has been the case in the rest of the United Kingdom as well. And I think people looking at the response of the Irish government and indeed the Northern Irish executive to COVID, on numerous occasions they've said and they've thought that the responses were sometimes inconsistent and incompatible. And when it comes to trying to respond to a pandemic, one of the things you need on an island is consistency and compatibility. I also think the discussion of Scottish independence, whether or not it happens or not, I don't know. But the fact that Scottish independence is being discussed more prominently raises the issue of what will happen to the Union of the United Kingdom should Scotland make that decision to leave. But I suppose the reason why I would like to start talking about it this evening is I think we need to have a historical context to us as well. And that's why I suppose Professor Eugenia was so interested in having this paper. And this year and the month of June will mark the centenary since the establishment of the Northern Ireland Parliament. And in the paper, I refer to what was said by King George V when he was opening the Parliament in Belfast. And he gave an extremely conciliatory speech, which ended with his exhortation that he hoped that someday the people, the Irish people, north and south, under one Parliament or two, as those parliaments may themselves decide, shall work together in common love for Ireland upon the sure foundations of mutual justice and respect. Now, unfortunately, the wishes of King George V did not transpire, and it's regrettably the case that the history of Northern Ireland was not dominated, but certainly characterised by strife, sectarianism, and regrettably violence. But also when we look at the history of Northern Ireland, we have to recognise its great achievements. And one of the great achievements of Northern Ireland was the agreement that was achieved by the political parties in Northern Ireland back in 1998, and also by the Irish and British government at that time. And I think the agreement that was achieved was a fantastic achievement, not just for the British government, but also for the Irish government. And we know that President Clinton similarly regards it as one of his great foreign policy achievements. And I suppose, simply put, when you look at what the agreement agreed in respect of the political and constitutional issues affecting Northern Ireland, it said something that sounds so simple today that it's surprising it was not always fully accepted. It said that the future of Northern Ireland should be decided by the people of Northern Ireland. And in the wording of the agreement, it recognised that the people of the jurisdiction of Northern Ireland could decide at a future date whether or not they wish to become part of a united Ireland. And as a result of that agreement, decisions were made to change the Irish constitution. We changed our Article 2 and 3, which had a territorial claim on Northern Ireland. And now the Irish constitution says a united Ireland shall be brought about only by peaceful means with the consent of a majority of the people, democratically expressed in both jurisdictions. Similarly, the British government changed the British constitution through the enactment of the Northern Ireland Act 1998, and it provided that Northern Ireland would remain a part of the United Kingdom, which was the clear wish of the people of Northern Ireland at that time in 1998, until such time as a majority of the people of Northern Ireland decided otherwise, and if they wished to join a united Ireland, well, that would be facilitated. And the schedule to that 1998 Act sets out the procedure by which a Secretary of State of Northern Ireland can make a decision to call a referendum on whether or not the people of Northern Ireland wish to remain part of the United Kingdom or alternatively to become part of a united Ireland. And he decides that, or she decides that, based on what he views or she views as being the current political support for that objective in Northern Ireland. We know from the decision in the Court of Appeal decision in Northern Ireland last year of the McCord case that that is purely a political judgment. But I think it is fair to say that political reality dictates that no Secretary of State is going to make that decision without the British government agreeing to it. And if the British government agreed to it, I think it would be unusual and surprising if there was not consultation in advance with an Irish government. I think that's why it's incumbent upon politicians such as me in Ireland and others to set forward, well, what would we see as being a unified Ireland if that occurred? And listen, for the purpose of this paper, and it's not for other purposes, but for the purpose of this paper, I am assuming that at some date in the next decade or so, a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland will make that decision to call for a referendum. I think that's a reasonable assumption. It's not an irrebuttable presumption, but I think it's a reasonable assumption based on the current political and demographic trajectory of Northern Ireland. But I think what needs to be done in advance is that before there's any date set for any such referendum, we need to ensure that we provide a response to some crucial issues. And the purpose of this paper this evening is try to deal with some of those issues. And can I just say, I'm just putting forward ideas. I have no doubt, and I know for a fact that there are very many people on this call and people elsewhere in Ireland and Britain who will have better and more coherent ideas than me in respect of what a unified Ireland should look like. But I think 4 questions that have to be considered and some form of an answer provided are: first, what would a united Ireland look like politically? Second, what would be the economic consequences of a united Ireland? Third, what laws would operate there? And fourth, what steps would be provided to ensure that the British identity of people from the unionist tradition would be recognised and respected in a united Ireland? And that's what I seek to do in this paper. And can I just say, I believe it would be chaotic and irresponsible if a referendum was put to the people of Northern Ireland in advance of efforts being made to answer those questions. And I also think we need to be realistic that, in fairness to unionist parties, if a referendum is being called, they're going to try to ensure that their cherished aim of retaining the union with Great Britain is maintained. So I think we need to recognise it's going to be unlikely for unionist political parties to get involved in advance of a referendum in sort of trying to define what a new Ireland would look like. And that's why I think this is a debate that needs to extend beyond political parties, and it needs to extend into communities in Northern Ireland, Ireland, and indeed Great Britain. In terms of what a new country would look like politically, Ireland has been well served by the written constitution that was promulgated here back in 1937. It has served us well. It can be amended to reflect different attitudes of Irish people over the decades. Britain also has a very well-serving constitution. It's not written, but it's recognised and expressed through conventions and through statute. My own assessment, however, is that if we're going to create a new country, and that's what those who want to see a united Ireland should seek to attain, to establish a new country. If we want a new country, we need to have a new constitution. And when you come to decide what a new constitution should look like, I suppose you have to frame it in the context of what are the politics operating in that country at that time. And I think it is extremely important that we don't shackle ourselves to the political disputes that operated and existed in Ireland back in the 1920s, or the political disputes that existed in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. Like at that time, 100 years ago, the predominant political dispute in Ireland was between unionist and nationalist, between Protestant and Catholic. The world and Northern Ireland and Ireland has significantly changed since then. And I think we need to recognise the different type of political fault lines that exist in Irish society on the island of Ireland at present. And they're not the same as the political fault lines that existed 100 or 50 years ago. And I set out some of those fault lines in the paper that I hope some of you will have a chance to look at. But I think the reason why it's important to recognise that we've moved beyond the political fault lines of 100 years ago is that one of the traditional grounds of opposition to unification made by unionism is that they are fearful that it will involve an homogenous group of Northern Catholic nationalists forcing an homogenous group of Northern Protestant unionists into a 32-county country that will be dominated by Northern and Southern Catholic Unionists. And listen, that is not an accurate presentation of how Ireland operates today, or indeed how Northern Ireland operates today. Another more benign analysis that can be put forward by unionism, and it's a legitimate argument, they may say their political influence will be significantly diminished if they get involved in a unified Ireland. But I also think that argument needs to be challenged, because if you look at the actual influence exerted by unionism in British politics at present, I think it is very limited. I know you may be able to point to the control and influence that the Democratic Unionist Party were able to exert over the British Conservative Party between 2017 and 2019, but that was a very limited, and it certainly wasn't a long-term influence. And I think because of the electoral system they have in the United Kingdom, it is unlikely that unionism will have the type of influence that it could have in a unified Ireland. For instance, in the 2019 United Kingdom British election, the DUP and the UUP secured 337,000 votes. That constituted 1.1% of the votes of the United Kingdom electorate in that election. If that had been translated into, along with the election that took place in Ireland in 2020, those unionist parties would have exerted an influence of over 11%. So I think it is true to say that in a united Ireland, political unionism would exert a much greater influence than it exerts in the United Kingdom. I think it also needs to be recognised and pointed out that the strong likelihood in a politically unified Ireland would be that political parties in the south who shared similar economic and social views on topics as parties from the unionist tradition in Northern Ireland would coalesce amongst themselves. So I think the country needs a new constitution. And what would that necessarily involve? We would have to ensure that we bring in electoral systems into the constitution that ensures that important office holders will have the trust and allegiance of all the communities of the island. Now, I'm not going to prescribe here and now what that type of electoral system should be, but it is available and we should look to pursue it. Obviously, the Constitution itself must protect a number of core fundamental values. I suppose the first thing is it must guarantee equality of representation to each citizen, but more importantly, it must ensure that each citizen and each group have their rights, their individual rights and their group rights protected and to be vindicated by the courts. I also think one thing we need to look at is perhaps the election of the chief office holders, whether it is the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister, the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach, the First Minister or the Deputy First Minister. I think it would be helpful if we looked at requiring that both of those offices would be filled by popular vote to ensure that unionist population in a particular type of electoral system would have a real say in the outcome of that. When it comes to the legislative body itself, you know, United Kingdom operates under a bicameral system, as does Ireland. Northern Ireland has a devolved unicameral system. A proposal I put forward in the paper is that we would look at retaining a bicameral system. We would have one house of legislature in Belfast, one in Dublin, and obviously there would be different powers afforded to whether it be the Irish Assembly or an Irish Senate. And obviously the advantage of having something like an Irish Senate is that you could ensure that unionism had a greater representation there. Although when it comes to an Irish Assembly or a Dáil, I think you'd have to ensure it was on a per capita basis. There would obviously be very many contentious issues, such as flags, emblems, and anthems. I don't have answers for them. And I think that they are issues that political parties need to be helped by representative groups, by ordinary people, by civic groups who would come together, whether through a citizens' assembly or otherwise, to put forward proposals. Because this debate will be very difficult for all political parties on the island, and sometimes it is helpful if people from outside the political party framework can come in and put forward their own proposals. In respect of the language, I think we should be able to recognise that there would be two national languages. In respect of neutrality, I know that would be a contentious issue, but can I just say in respect of it, in Ireland there's always been a strong tradition, even after independence, of people continuing to join and their families continuing to join in the armed forces of the United Kingdom. There's no reason why that wouldn't continue in the aftermath should there be unification of both sides of the island. In terms of policing, I think one of the great successes of independent Ireland and indeed the peace process in Northern Ireland is on Garda Síochána and the PSNI respectively. They both quickly got the support of the local communities that they service, and I think we should retain a regional policing system if we ever do see unity. I think the courts have operated consistently. I think we both operate under a common law system. I don't see difficulties in the courts reaching some form of close cooperation, and I think that should be retained. I also think we need to recognise, however, that unity does not mean immediate harmonisation or immediate uniformity. In fact, sometimes it doesn't mean uniformity at all. We've seen federal countries around the world where they have different laws operating in different jurisdictions of the federation. Listen, in terms of the economic consequences of unification, you know, one thing I do not think we should get into is a game of economic one-upmanship, where we start to say that, you know, there's a better economy now in the south as opposed to the north, or the north saying that we have a better health service. In terms of the economic consequences, I think we need to recognise that this is primarily a political issue and a political question, but it does require a consideration of the economic consequences. And I suppose when you look at the island of Ireland, I suppose one of the dramatic economic changes on the island has been the transformation of the economy in Ireland since we joined the European Union, and in particular since we became members of the single market was established. Northern Ireland, in fairness, and I'm sure if there were unionist politicians sitting here beside me, they would say that their economy has suffered as a result of 30 years of violence, and that is true. But I think it is the case, and it's not something that I have said. If you look at independent reports by John Fitzgerald and Edgar Morganroth, you can see that the Northern Ireland economy has not performed as well as it could perform. But listen, we need to ensure that there's a certain amount of ambition in terms of what we would propose to do. Like just on a more base level, if we were to amalgamate a market of 4.8 million people in Ireland and 1.9 million people in Northern Ireland, it would obviously create a significantly larger market for the provision and consumption of goods and services. I believe if we retained a very attractive corporation tax rate, as we have in Southern Ireland, that would attract in further foreign direct investment into Ireland. So as my own view is that the opportunities for the island are only limited by our own collective imaginations. I think it would be a very exciting prospect economically, and I think it's something that we should give consideration to, and I'll have an opportunity to speak to Eugenio in more detail about the economic consequences in due course. Listen, in terms of trying to protect and recognise and guarantee the culture and traditions of unionism within a new Ireland, I think that's something that would be an absolute imperative requirement of any proposal that we put forward. But listen, I have no doubt that Ulster unionism will be protected and its traditions will be valued, not simply because there will be rights written into our constitution to ensure that happens, but also because, as I said earlier, that we would structure our political structures in such a way to ensure that unionism was protected. But I think we need to recognise that there will be greater harmonisation along political lines on bread and butter political issues in the aftermath of unification. And one of the things that is absolutely sure, and I have no doubt about it, is that there won't be any diminution in the traditions and culture of unionism. People from the unionist tradition should still be entitled to maintain and retain their British citizenship. And the way that can be done is the same way that nationalists in Northern Ireland to date have been able to retain their Irish citizenship. In the aftermath, if there was a unification poll, obviously anyone born in Northern Ireland should indefinitely be entitled to procure and retain British citizenship. I also think if Scottish independence arises, it'll be more important than ever that unionist people from Scotland and unionist people from Ireland have structures within the two Ireland bases to ensure that their interests continue to be homogenised and represented. And I think one of the underused organs of the Good Friday Agreement is the British-Irish Council, which really needs to be used in much further detail. So as I'm going to conclude, and I've gone through this paper very quickly, I'm going to conclude because I prefer to hear more from others rather than myself. And I think, once again, people who are nationalists, people who are Republicans need to challenge themselves to look at it from the other perspective. For very many years, nationalists and Republicans blamed the Westminster Parliament for partition. The reality was that there were huge divisions in Irish society back in 1920 and 1921 that led to partition. I believe it was the incorrect decision. But as I say in the paper, I don't think it was an irrational decision. But as the world has changed, as other issues have become more into perspective, I think the maintenance of the division on the island of Ireland is becoming irrational. And that's why I think it is important that we engage in this debate. It should be a debate that should be respectful, and I think it's a legitimate debate to have. And I think we need to recognize that there will be a very strong argument being made by people from the unionist tradition to retain the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Like, the status quo is always the easier argument to make when it comes to quite significant change. But either way, it is an issue that should be decided by discussion, debate, and ultimately democracy. And thank you very much for listening to me. And now I'll be very happy to listen to Eugenia.
Thank you, Jim. This has been a wide-ranging a paper, and of course there is much more which could be said about each of the headings which you have raised, and we know that we shall have other opportunities to do so. But just to get the debate, the discussion started, it seems to me you have focused primarily on three issues. I mean, the economy would be the fourth one, but the three most contentious ones are the constitution, issues which are identity related, and issues which are have to do with the referendum. And of course, the three are reciprocally linked. Yesterday evening, the RT debate, there were very interesting points made by all the speakers, but one of the most striking was made by Naomi Long, the leader of the Alliance Party, and she pointed out that Northern Ireland is such a segregated society that if the two communities had a different ethnicity, you could tell them apart. They look exactly the same, but you could tell them apart as you may do in America or somewhere else. You'd be shocked. Anybody would be shocked by the extent to which they are segregated. This is a partition in the mind, isn't it? So the starting point, perhaps, in my questions would be, how would you plan to deal with this partition in the mind, with this segregation, which is not a political decision of anybody except the people who are themselves interested?
Yeah, I saw Naomi last night, and it was a very interesting contribution. And of course, that's an issue that has to be dealt with, irrespective of whether there's any debate or discussion about a referendum. And in terms of trying to ensure there is greater understanding between communities in Northern Ireland, I think we need to recognise that a lot of marginalised communities in Northern Ireland are at the coalface of that polarisation. And I think we need to ensure that those polarised groups are brought along in terms of through greater investment, greater recognition as well, that politics in Northern Ireland cannot still be presented as being unionist and nationalist. I think that does a disservice to the progressive voices in both political viewpoints, and it also seems to ignore the fact that they're not harmonious, homogenous groups. So I think we need to ensure that the different groups, for instance, sporting organisations, women's groups, marginalised groups, need to engage with each other more. And probably the greatest achievements in terms of breaking down barriers in Northern Ireland has been achieved not through political parties, but through civic interaction on the ground. And irrespective of the unification debate, that needs to continue. But in terms of looking at an expanded country, like, I think polarisation wouldn't cease, but I think it would be mellowed if the countries merged together and you had this larger groupings of society where greater political issues could come into focus, where the political fault lines wouldn't be unionist, nationalist, Catholic, Protestant. And I think those greater political fault lines would become more apparent in a united Ireland than in the 6-county Northern Ireland that exists at present.
Yes, I take all of this. Do you think the Constitution will play a major role? I mean, the debates about the possible Constitution of the future could play a major role in reshaping attitudes to the whole issue of unification.
Yes, I think when you look at a country and you want to find out what type of a country it is, one of the first things you do is you look to see, well, can I see its constitution? And as I said in the presentation, I think it is very important that we are ambitious in our constitution, that we try to create political structures that are inclusive, that we try to ensure, as the Irish constitution did, that personal rights are protected and vindicated. And we may need to go further in a new constitution to ensure that the rights of groups are given specific recognition within that constitution. And of course, one of the difficulties we have in Ireland, and I'm sure in Northern Ireland as well, is in terms of people trying to vindicate their rights. Sometimes they have to use their own resources to go to court. I think we need to have statutory mechanisms in place to ensure, for instance, that equality provisions are given proper effect in terms of a new country, so that the equality principle that would exist within the new constitution would have meaning.
So what's wrong with the existing constitution of the Republic of Ireland?
Well, I think in terms of trying to create a new country, that one of the arguments, I had a debate with Ian Paisley a number of months ago on this very topic. And what surprised me was that Ian was asking, well, what are you offering us? It was as though there was an effort by the southern state to try to take over the northern state. And that is a fear that the northern unionist community have. But that's not what I'm talking about, or most Republicans are talking about when we talk about a unified country. We need something new. And I think it would not serve the purpose of being seen to establish a new country by simply stating, okay, you're operating under Bunreacht na hÉireann. Bunreacht na hÉireann has served the country well, but we need a new constitution that recognizes and gives effects to the rights of individuals. Like, part of the reason why polarization continues is because so many groups in both northern society and society down here have been marginalized. We need to try to ensure that we have a vibrant constitution that gives effect to protecting them from marginalization. And listen, people may want to include socioeconomic rights within it to ensure that something practical happens to their marginalized state.
So is the issue individual rights or rights of groups and communities? The two
well,
things
like most constitutions contain individual rights and concentrate on personal rights. But I suppose when you look at the personal right, for instance, to assemble, that does refer to and include collective rights as well. But I think we need to ensure that a new constitution does contain rights for groups. And, if we wanted to, we could expressly spell out the groups that deserve specific recognition and protection. Now, I suppose once you start identifying one group, you can get into the difficulty of why weren't other groups named. But it can also be done under a statutory mechanism as well. But I think it is important that a new constitution will recognise not just the rights of individuals, but the rights of groups and the rights of traditions and heritages associated with that.
And how would you go about debating such a constitution? How would you involve communities into this process?
Well, I think that is very important. And as I said earlier, I think we would be expecting too much to expect unionist parties to engage in advance of a vote on whether or not there should be United Ireland or retain within the United Kingdom. And I think we need to move beyond political parties. And I think there's a responsibility on sporting bodies. I think there's a responsibility on trade unions, on business groups. Like, in many instances, there is cooperation ongoing and cross-border action ongoing in all these different groups. And I think they probably need to ensure that they take the lead as well, because membership of political parties, it can have great advantages in terms of trying to change things, but it also can be quite limiting in terms of trying to move from positions that you're entrenched in. And that's why I think situations such as civic assemblies or citizens' assemblies would be very beneficial in trying to deal with these issues, such as the constitution and symbols and emblems.
Do the churches have a role to play? The churches are the only organizations, I think, which are not partitioned, which have never been partitioned.
The IRFU, the Irish Rugby Football Union, wasn't partitioned. A number of sporting bodies weren't partitioned. The churches weren't partitioned. Listen, the church will have a very important role to play. Whether or not we start putting into the Constitution specific references to churches, I don't know. I think we should include in our Constitution a specific protection for those who wish to practice religion. But in terms of the religious divide that existed back in 1920, Eugenio, of which you will be well aware, the main religious divide that exists in Ireland today isn't between Catholic and Protestant. It is between people who are religious, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, and Jewish, and those who aren't religious. So like there's a lot of issues in common that the churches now have, which if we were looking at this topic 100 years ago, we wouldn't have considered.
Thank you. I would have many more questions to ask, but I see time is against us, and perhaps we should move to the questions from the floor, so to speak. Barry.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. I was just about to say that, as interesting as this is, there have been about 1 million questions submitted over the last 20 minutes, some of which Jim couldn't be expected to answer because it pertains to basically broadly what United Ireland could look like from any number of angles. But Jim, I've grouped some of the questions we've received across a couple of themes that we'll hopefully have time to get through. You've addressed some of them in your intervention, and you certainly will address some of them in your paper, which I'd encourage people to read. The first set of questions pertain to some of the practicalities of preparing for unity. The first one I'll ask, Jim, Nick Westcott asked this question, a similar question, but it was Professor D. Heenan from the University of Ulster. Professor Heenan asks, how would Jim see the two very different health systems currently on the island, both with their own systemic failings, being integrated in the event of unity? For example, would he envisage a new all-island healthcare system model on the NHS, free at the point of delivery, or something else? Very topical. Perhaps you have something to say.
Yeah, it's a very challenging and good question as well. But like in terms of a referendum on unification, one of the arguments that no doubt would be advanced by unionist politicians is that, listen, we have a fantastic NHS, look at the rollout of the vaccination program. But I think it's important that we need to recognize that unity does not mean immediate harmonization. It doesn't mean uniformity. There's a lot of cross-border cooperation going on in terms of the training of healthcare workers and in the treatment of health at present. And I suppose from the point of view of a Northern Ireland audience, I should say that the current Irish policy when it comes to healthcare is encompassed by the Sláinte Care document that was agreed by all parties in the Oireachtas. It's, I suppose, referenced and recognised in the current programme for government of the Irish government, which is entitled Universal Healthcare, which is a clear statement of where we as a country are going. And I suppose the path that we are on puts Ireland on a path that is going to lead to convergence of standards between the two parts of the island. And obviously, if you look at short-term commitments that have been made in Ireland as opposed to Northern Ireland, we have short-term commitments that include extending free GP care to more children and older people. And although we don't have free at the point of delivery as yet, it is, I would have thought, a very clear point of direction to where Ireland is heading. So I think there would be convergence between the two jurisdictions when it came to healthcare. The end point would be free at the point of delivery. But let's be realistic, this is not going to be harmonised overnight, and it is going to take Ireland time to catch up with the quality and standard of healthcare given provided by the NHS, just as it will take time for Northern Ireland to catch up in terms of wages in the south, which are higher than wages in Northern Ireland, or indeed social welfare rates. So listen, we can easily identify differences between the two jurisdictions. And not everything is going to be harmonised immediately. But just because that is the case, it doesn't mean that we can't have collective agreement as to what is the ultimate destination for us when it comes to any particular topic or issue.
Okay, very good. Watch this space, I'd say. Now, there was a number of very good questions about the legislative structure of a future All-Ireland Parliament. I couldn't get through all of them, but I'm going to link two of them together. Firstly, from Martin MacDonald. Martin asks, why complicate the legislative process with a bicameral system? Why not try to avoid the gridlock of the US and Italian systems, by establishing one single parliament that rotates between Belfast and Dublin, like the European Parliament does? Relatedly, Paul Fox asks, where does Jim see the role of Stormont in a shared island? Would you see it as currently it operates as a regional assembly with an improved role for the North-South ministerial council meetings, for example? Again, mentioned in your paper and in your intervention. Perhaps you want to comment, Jim?
Well, I suppose every proposed solution for the Irish question, if you go back to the first Home Rule Bill, or certainly the second Home Rule Bill, and the Government of Ireland Act 1914, which gave statutory effect to the third Home Rule Bill. And if you look at the Free State Parliament, we always envisaged that there would be a bicameral system. And I suppose the reason for it is it gives us greater opportunity to ensure that other traditions are represented. If we're simply going to have a unicameral one-house system, like, it's inevitable that that is going to have to be elected based on the quality of representation, which means, I suppose, we would have multi-seat constituency. Unionism would get 11.3% of the seats in that assembly. The advantage of a bicameral system is that you can bring different voices and different traditions into the legislative process. Now listen, the Irish Senate and the House of Lords have many faults, and I would not advocate that if we were introducing a bicameral system that we would have an upper house based on the House of Lords or the Irish Senate. It would really need to have more substantive powers. But the advantage of it, and the reason why, for instance, the 1937 Constitution brought in a Seanad, was try to bring in different interests. We tried to bring in vocational interests in 1937. It didn't work in practice, but that was the objective. In terms of Stormont, I recommended in the paper that if we are going to have a bicameral system, that obviously one house should be in Stormont, one house should be in Dublin. In terms of a federal system, listen, I'm sure other people have as good as better ideas than me when it comes to having a federal system. Another option is that Stormont could remain and there would still be a federal system operating in terms of Northern Ireland as it exists today. My own view, however, is that I think we should try, like, it's a small island. It would be a small country. I think in terms of trying to operate a federal system would nearly make it more complicated. I think we should just make the bold decision, if that is the decision that people of Northern Ireland make, and it is their decision, I think we should make the bold decision to try to have a bicameral system that reflects all walks in society in the upper chamber. And we could do quite exciting things when it comes to the constitution of that upper chamber.
Extremely interesting. I'd love to talk more about, for example, the role of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference and the role of London overall, but this is for another day perhaps, because I want to keep on moving. I should say as well, of the literally dozens of questions we have, I will share them with Jim. We're only going to get to a handful, but the ones we don't read, we'll send to his office nonetheless. I'd like to turn to a second group of questions, hoping to get to 4 in total. You say in your paper and intervention, Jim, a new Ireland requires a new constitution. These questions pertain to, these questions pertain to minorities and human rights, which are of course highly topical in the context of Northern Ireland especially. Firstly, of 2, I'll read them both. From Eilish Rooney, Eilish asks, what are the economic consequences for economically marginalised groups, including women, of Irish reunification? And secondly, Colin Harvey asks, how would you ensure human rights are effectively protected in United Ireland? Again, 2 massive questions, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, in terms of Eilish's question, like, it does raise the issue, you know, what's the point of doing this? Like, is there much point in doing this if it is just to appease the desire of Northern nationalists to become part of a reunified country? That's a legitimate aspiration, but I think what will make this an exciting debate is if we try to present something and propose something that is different. Like, in terms of Eilish's question, like, the Irish Revolution promised great things for women, but it didn't deliver on that. And when we look at how the Irish Free State developed, it was a very repressive state for women after independence. And I think we need to ensure that all marginalised groups in the aftermath of the establishment of a unified country would have adequate protection and adequate protection economically. In terms of the specifics of our question about how women who can be a marginalised group, how would we protect them? I think we having a conversation about the disadvantages and discrimination faced by women is helpful in itself. I know that employment in Northern Ireland and Ireland is characterised by gender segregated labour markets, gender gaps in pay. There are issues that we were speaking about earlier today. And we will have to ensure that the new Ireland we are developing, whether it be through statute or in the Constitution, would challenge that and would ensure that marginalised groups would not remain marginalised. And if we're trying to ensure, as Eugenio said earlier on, that we can attract groups that are engaged in polarised politics out of their polarised state, we need to put forward exciting and imaginative proposals as to how the quality of their lives would change. Because the reality is, unless we can persuade people and give effect to it, to the effect that their quality of life will change, their standard of living would change in a new Ireland, well, then there may be a question mark over what's the point of doing it. In terms of what Colin Harvey has asked about human rights, I suppose both jurisdictions now comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. I think that should be the basis upon which human rights operates in a new Ireland. I think we would need to ensure, however, that the rights are given proper effect through, I suppose, a real and vibrant authority that can challenge discrimination of those rights and breaches of those rights by the state. But I think we need a written constitution that would encapsulate the rights that at present exist within the European Convention on Human Rights. In terms of rights that we all enjoy today, I don't think it would be feasible for any new country to take away rights that any person enjoys in Ireland or in Northern Ireland at present. I don't think that would be feasible. But I think we do need to ensure that this new country protects the personal and group rights of individuals.
Fantastic. We have 8 minutes left, so I want to try and move swiftly to our penultimate group of questions. And it pertains to a set of questions we could not do any major service to in such a short amount of time. It relates to how you envisage all the peoples of the island, including unionists, would fit within the new Ireland framework. I acknowledge good questions from Brad Edward Anderson, David Livington, and others regarding the technicality of how this might happen. I'd encourage you to look at Jim's paper for that. But I want to ask two questions again, yoked together, Jim, from James McCarran first. Last night on Claire Byrne, I'm sure many of us watched, Mary Lou McDonald and Leo Varadkar seemed much more open to holding a border poll. Taoiseach Martin seemed much more reluctant and appeared to agree with the suggestion that unionist consent is essential. Do you agree? Secondly, from Jeff Hare, would the Irish government deal with the views, how would the Irish government, deal with the views of the loyalists who would not, under any circumstances, want to have a united Ireland? Two small questions, Jim.
Well, I watched the debate last night just in response to James' question. I thought the Taoiseach gave a very coherent response to it. Like me, the Taoiseach is an Irish Republican. He has vast experience in this area. He's a very good relationship with the unionist parties and unionist tradition in Northern Ireland. I know sometimes people like to present him as being lukewarm about this issue. I disagree. He has set up a shared Ireland unit within the Department of An Taoiseach. It has real power. And I think the Taoiseach recognises that there is going to be a referendum in due course. But I suppose what he is trying to say, and I think it is important that it be said, like if we rush into having a referendum next year, it'll be chaotic. We need to do the preparatory work for it. I know that in respect of another issue that we're all dealing with now, that sometimes the exhortation is concentrate on data, not dates. When it comes to a referendum on a unified country, I think we should concentrate on issues, not dates. Let us deal with the issues that we've outlined, that I've outlined in the paper, and all the myriad of other issues. Let us have greater engagement between different civic communities, between sporting bodies, between trade unions and business organizations. And I think then that will make it a smoother passage. In terms of unionist consent is essential. When we talk about unionist consent, again, we're trying to present unionism as one homogenous group in the same way as people try to present nationalism or republicanism as one homogenous group. It isn't. There are different strands within it. And I think we do a disservice to progressive voices in both of those traditions by simply presenting them as one monolith. Like we're not, I want to see, I do not want this to turn into, as the former Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern once said, I do not want to see this to turn into a sectarian headcount. If that's it, I don't want to be part of it. And I suspect most Republicans and nationalists won't want to be part of it. But what we need to ensure is that we come forward with something exciting that arouses the imagination of people in Northern Ireland and on the whole island. And that is an exciting prospect we all need to engage with. In terms of the other question about how would you deal with loyalists who are very opposed to this, and people are going to be very opposed to it. But listen, in terms of the one message and one lesson that I hope we in Ireland have learned from, is that, you know, violence does not succeed unless you have democratic support. And you know, there is no democratic support for the violence that happened previously, and I don't think there would be democratic support for any prospective violence in the future. And I think we need to recognise that the days of violence in Ireland are over, and we need to ensure that we're over. And the way we ensure that they're over is by engaging with people and dealing with the issues that affect people. Listen, we had a great achievement in this country in 1998. It was one of the great historic peace achievements of the world, and we should learn from that, that it's absolutely essential that we engage with all groups to ensure that they feel as though they're being brought along.
Brilliant. Another historic achievement is about to be made, because I'm going to give two groups of questions to you in under 6 minutes, right? The first one coming from Brendan Sims, who's also of both Ireland and this parish, like Jim and myself. Jim asks, and it's a toughie, if unionists would be numerically better represented in Dublin than Westminster, wouldn't, by the same logic, the inhabitants of the 26 counties be better represented in the UK Union than in the EU? Chew over that. The second one of two, Jim, just hang on, because this came in a couple of different forms from John Cartledge and Douglas Howie. Might a unified Ireland as a SOPT unionist be prepared to join the Commonwealth? Perhaps the less extreme of the two options.
Okay, well, in terms of Brendan's point, would Ireland not be better off part of the United Kingdom than the EU? I think that misunderstands that the EU is different from the United Kingdom. The EU is made up of independent member states. The UK is an independent state. So, like, I don't think it is, with all due respect to an appropriate comparison, but I think it is a valid point about the fact that unionism will have a much greater political say in the governance of the area of Northern Ireland, and indeed all of Ireland, than it does at present through its membership of the United Kingdom. In terms of the Commonwealth, I think the Commonwealth is often thrown out as a sop to appease unionism, say, oh, sure, you can join the Commonwealth. I think we need to look much more deeply at what is required to recognise and respect and protect unionist identity. And my own view is that the British Irish Council offers a much better format for doing that. In particular, that will become even more pronounced if it is the case that Scotland left the United Kingdom. There would then be a significant number of Scottish unionists who may feel as though their interests were not being adequately represented. And I think in that context, with unionism from the island of Ireland, unionism from Scotland, unionism from England and Wales, that would be a very effective mechanism and construct to ensure that unionism remained in touch with other unionist traditions on the islands and to ensure its ongoing protection as well.
Jim, if we could just afford maybe 2-3 more minutes of your time, and for anyone who has to clock off, we did say we finish now, so that's no offense.
Fine.
I want to thank everyone for all the questions, because there really were some humdingers, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but I'm going to just read 3 short ones that came in, Jim, as kind of a concluding section. First one is from Emma McCardle. An Taoiseach constantly says the time is not right. What time might Jim deem appropriate for a referendum? Secondly, John Innes says, are there possibilities of the population of Ireland rejecting a unified Ireland? I think a really good question, and it deserves a lot of thought and analysis. And finally, a good one to conclude on. Martina Devlin asks, why do you believe a united Ireland will benefit the entire island?
Okay.
Thoughts there?
Yeah. First of all, the Taoiseach is asked, I suppose, issues are posed to them in response to other politicians putting forward proposals, okay? And, you know, other political parties want to have a fairly quick border poll. So the Taoiseach is right, in my opinion, saying the time is not right. My own assessment, as I say in the paper, is that it is likely within the 2020s that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland will call a referendum. I don't know when it's going to be, but I certainly know that in advance of it, people who are interested in trying to achieve unification have a responsibility to answer the issues that not just unionist people from Northern Ireland, but all people in Northern Ireland maybe will want to know, well, what's going to happen in terms of if I vote in favour of a unified Ireland. Second, in terms of the question that was put forward by John, which is a very legitimate question, you know, people in Ireland as well will want to know, well, what's going to be the consequence of this? You know, notwithstanding our travails, Ireland has been a very successful country since we got our independence. We've been a remarkable good example of what can happen. as a result of a country gaining its independence from a colonial power and then really advancing significantly. And I suppose I refer to that as well to those people who say, well, let's look at the economic threat that may be posed as a result of unification. Like if you were to say to Irish people back in 1920, 1921, the economic fortunes of the country at that stage were dire. But like we have to look at the long picture. And like Ireland has done extremely well economically. But specifically to answer John's question, unless we do the preparatory work that I'm suggesting here, yes, there is a prospect that the people of Ireland could reject the proposal, because there's also a requirement for what will probably be a subsequent referendum in the South for the purpose of approving it. And it's important that that gets the support, otherwise it'll be totally rejected. And that would be a terrible situation if the people of Northern Ireland voted for it, and then there was a vote in the South saying that we weren't going to go along with it. And in terms of the last question, sorry, Barry, was it United? Will you remind me of the last question? I have a note here and I can't read my writing.
Absolutely. So it was from Martina Devlin, and Martina asked.
Sorry, apologies to Martina. Yeah, what's the purpose of a united Ireland? It's a very good question in terms of why are we debating this? And as I say, if it's just to sort of, for romantic reasons, for historical reasons, I don't think it's worth the huge effort. But the reason for it is I believe that this island and the people on the island would prosper much more by living on a unified island. I believe that both parts of the island suffered very negatively as a result of partition. I believe we talk about what happened in Northern Ireland. I think both communities suffered in Northern Ireland, particularly the nationalist community. And in Southern Ireland, we suffered from losing the brilliance and the intervention of unionism throughout on the island. And I just think it will improve the quality of life of people on the island. It's an opportunity for us to put forward a constitution as to how we believe that the new Ireland should operate. It would be an opportunity for us to try to ensure that there was greater equality on both sides of the island, and to ensure that we recognise that marginalised groups need to be given further protection by the state. And it would be a good way of having a discussion about that in order to ensure that it occurred. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I tried.
I did in a certain form, absolutely. Thanks a million, Jim. Really, really enjoyed the discussion. Hopefully it'll be the first of many to everyone on the call. I should have said from the outset, I wanted to thank briefly Francesca Kay at the British Irish Association, not just for their sterling work generally, but also for helping to promote the event. So thanks, partly the reason why we're here in such good numbers. I don't know if Professor Biagini wants to say anything.
I'm just really grateful to you and to Jim and to the college for organizing this event, and to Jim in particular for accepting to address and speak on this very important topic in such a brilliant way as he has done. Thank you.
Good. Thank you all, and keep an eye out for the next one. I'm sure, as I say, there'll be plenty more. So stay healthy, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Good luck.